I know. This class is PE elementary. I didn't take that PE class. It's not very related. No, it's not finished. So I have a wait list. I think I'm on.
Like sophomore, I would like to. It's kind of high school, so I'm really going to go to all.
I did How was it on the other? I have no idea.
Like weekly. Dude, one thing I wanted to one thing I wanted to
I mentioned my
one day that after that. I had 2 people invite me.
I actually want to.
I'll be one way.
Okay. Let me text Kendra. All right, it's just about 11 o'clock. I'd like to get underway. As you can see, for this week, what we're going to be discussing is Africa. But as what's important to note is that when we talk about Africa, in a historical sense, we're not going to be looking at all of the continent of modern-day Africa. You notice that our focus is really going to be on what we refer to as Sub-Saharan Africa. So really leaving aside many of those Muslim territories up here in the north, which in fact are very discussed in other contexts. It is fair to say that on the whole, it is very difficult to study Africa in the period that we were looking at in this class, sort of pre-1500 period. It is fair to say that Sub-Saharan Africa tends to move to patterns that are really quite different from some of the other civilizations in which we've been studying. The way some people would describe it, for better or for worse, Sub-Saharan Africa very often has not gotten caught up in a lot of the storms and some of the areas further to the north that have been talked about, and has not had as much contact with them. And we'll talk about some of those few sort of small contacts that people of Sub-Saharan Africa did have with outsiders, but they were far fewer than other places we've seen. And as a result of this, what we end up seeing on the whole is that really there are not a lot of things that issue forth from Sub-Saharan Africa that make it out. And there's not also a lot of cultural influences that come in either during this time period. There's just a limited amount of interaction with outsiders. As we'll see later on, when there are contacts with the outsiders, they tend to come mainly in places that are the coasts, and very often they tend to involve trade. Another thing we'll also see during this period is that Africa was on certain people's maps, and especially missionaries we know will end up coming and going to parts of Africa during this time period, both Christian and then Muslim. But again, we're really talking about, by and large, small-scale encounters. There's never, a full, there's no invasion of sub-Saharan Africa or anything like that during this time period. And so, at least some people would say that sub-Saharan Africa is not fully sucked up into the currents of world history until the 19th century, where you see this much more concerted push by many Western Europe, often with, of course, with bad intent, to go to sub-Saharan Africa. Part of the difficulty that we face in trying then to reconstruct the history of sub-Saharan Africa is that we don't have a lot of reports of outsiders coming there. And as we'll see, by and large, sub-Saharan Africa tended to be non-literate. A lot of these civilizations we know about just for whatever reason did not develop writing, which can be quite challenging. And it means very often that we have to fall back upon physical evidence often to try to describe things about this civilization. So just to give you one example of the kind of challenges that we face doing this, these are the ruins of what is known as Kumbi Saleh. This was the capital city of the Ghana Empire, this West African empire that we'll talk about a little bit in greater detail later on. Here I'm just showing you to give you some idea of what the problems are that we face, and that if you look at a structure like this, kind of structures that we know once housed a capital, it can give you some knowledge, of course, what were their building techniques, how many people approximately could go to this kind of building, those sorts of things. It can't tell us much about the people who lived there, though, and what they thought or how they acted, just based upon these kind of physical remains. Another source that people often try to draw upon for the earliest periods of sub-Saharan Africa is a source that you already know well. We said it's important for the Paleolithic across the board, and that is cave art. And in what today is modern-day Algeria, around here, there's a group of mountains known as the Tassili Mountains. And for sub-Saharan Africa, this is proven to be one of our greatest sources of cave art. Some of these caves in here. Just to give you some idea of what we're talking about, the same, very similar kind of cave art that we've seen in other places. Again, sometimes you'll see people depicted. Sometimes you see these very exaggerated images that appears to be something like a monster looming over others. Cave art people are always interested in the hunt, and presumably what their food would be. Here's an actual example we can see here. It appears to be people going to hunt, maybe a stampede down here. This, of course, is not. This is actually a painting. This is a very famous example of kind of a gazelle-like animal, and you can see there's actually a carving also inside the Tassili Mountains. Now, we're lucky to have this kind of art, of course, but at least with the current state of our knowledge, it's very difficult to relate the art inside a cave to anything that was happening outside. To give you some idea of just how poor our dating is currently, this cave art has been dated anywhere from 8,000 BCE to the early years of the Common Era, which is an over 8,000 year span, which for historical purposes is absolutely useless. I mean, you can't tell me something happened anywhere in the space of 8,000 years and really expect me to relate that to any event that happened outside. So at least our current knowledge, it's hard to know what to do with these. Another source that we have that people try to draw upon to talk about sub-Saharan Africa is artwork. And scattered across this large region, we'll find all sorts of carvings and sculpture that will help us interpret these people's culture. And to give you one very famous example, in modern-day Nigeria, right around, let's go back again. So right in the northern part of Nigeria, we've managed to identify what we refer to as the Nok culture. And we can get some idea of the kind of sculpture that the Nok culture produced. These kind of interesting terracotta images, often of human beings. And really, in some ways, not very naturalistic human beings. You'll notice they'll have like these very long, elongated sort of faces. In this case, obviously very small arms. Here's an example from the Nok culture of a woman sculpted. I'm told a man riding on hippo, although you can believe that or not. Part of the problem with this artwork is, again, a question of dating. The terracotta figures that we get from the Nok culture are dated anywhere from 900 BCE to 200 CE. So again, a period of time that is enormous, over a millennium. And it's very difficult to work with as a historian. And just because we have these sculptures doesn't mean we have any idea of how they fit into the original culture in which they're produced. I mean, why did people make these? Was it art for art's sake? Did they have a religious meaning? We really have no idea. And that, of course, is a great difficulty for us because, again, it's really difficult to say what place these things had. And part of the problem, too, is like a lot of African art, these things from the Nok culture were excavated and then very promptly taken out of the original context. We were not able to relate to anything. We don't even know exactly where they were taken out of the ground from, they very promptly got sold off to places in Western Europe and eventually the Americas. So actually, Nok art became a chic purchase at a certain point, believe it or not. I mean, like, people really wanted to purchase this stuff, no matter how it was acquired. Another kind of source that people often fall back upon in trying to talk about sub-Saharan Africa is a source known as a periplus. Periplus is a term, kind of a weird term. This is a term from the Greek that means sailing around. And what a periplus is, in essence, is a guide for merchants. A periplus tells you as a merchant where you, as a merchant, especially in the ancient world, where you should travel, and once you get there, what you can trade for. And to help you give you some idea of like what exactly is in a periplus, this map gives you one example of a periplus. That's actually, they helpfully will map out for you the different places that are listed. As you can see, many of them are in places like India, but also on the east coast of Africa. And there are other peripluses we have that actually will touch on places in Africa. These sources are extremely helpful to us as historians because it does tell us that there were some form of market in these areas, and it did tell you what kind of goods these people brought to market. What these sources do not tell us, however, and this is true of peripluses from Greece or Rome or even Persia, they don't really say anything outside of economic concerns. The primary purpose of these documents was not to observe people. They could care less about these people they were coming in contact with. What they wanted to know was, where can I get the goods? And for that reason, it's a little frustrating to us because these merchants must have had some ideas about these people they came into contact with. But if so, they didn't bother sharing them with us, and so they lost to history. What are the final other sources that sometimes people will, in the past, historians wanted to use to be able to talk about sub-Saharan Africa in this period we're studying in this class are anthropological reports, especially from late 18th and 19th century, and normally Western Europeans or Americans. Part of the goal of anthropologists, so people who study different civilizations, was always to try to go to some place in Africa in which they had had no contact or very little contact with any outsiders, to be able to describe what they saw. And at least in the past, sometimes historians had great optimism that you could use these kind of anthropological reports to talk about a much distant past. But they're really, nowadays, very often people have pointed out some of the problematic assumptions that went with this, which is to say that very often people used to think that, well, these civilizations don't really change that much. They're extremely conservative, so I can look at the culture now and talk about what happened centuries ago. But that, of course, is not a fair assumption. And it would appear bizarre to us, for instance, to go today, say, to Italy, to talk about how people lived their lives in the Roman Empire. And it's no less absurd to go to Africa in the 19th century and talk about the way people lived in the 10th century. So really, altogether, most people tend to really inch away from using these kinds of reports, other than talking about what they saw in the 19th century when they actually came into contact, where these reports are extremely useful. Altogether, what this means is that a lot of African history really must remain an obscure business. And even if we do discover more physical sources, there are going to probably still be huge gaps in our knowledge. This doesn't mean, of course, that we should be totally hopeless, and there are ways we can even use some of the sources we already have and use them more creatively. So, for instance, one very interesting study that was done of Sub-Saharan Africa analyzed legends of migration. Many of these very sort of like, fantastical, sort of like, very imaginative kind of legends that talked about people moving within Africa. And while they thought most of the details were made up, what's very interesting is that this historian looked at these different stories and saw the direction of the migration was almost exactly the same. There was always a constant movement from the north to the south, which tends us to reinforce the notion that this is actually the direction in which a lot of people tended to migrate. It may not be a huge result, but that's something. And it's using the kind of sources we do have and using them better. Part of the limiting factor, both for life and really probably for the production of sources in sub-Saharan Africa, comes with the environment. And this is part of the reason why we think with very gross difficulties with the environment in sub-Saharan Africa was part of the reason why the population never gets very high, and why, frankly, people probably have other problems to worry about other than preserving their history for the future. Some of you know, first of all, Africa is a place, sub-Saharan Africa is a place of enormous diversity. Within Africa are contained, for instance, two enormous deserts, especially the Sahara up in the north, but also a desert in the southwest, which of course are virtually uninhabitable. Toward the equator in Africa, there tend to be rainforests, which again are not easy to live in. Most of the other land in the north and the south is this territory. This is what is known as savanna. These kind of woodlands, in which you notice that the trees never actually form a canopy over the land, and these kind of grasslands as well. None of these places are actually particularly easy to live in, and in fact, in many cases, later on, as they begin to incorporate both agriculture and sometimes later on machines from the outside, they can begin to tackle these areas a little bit more easily. But what this means, by and large, just the upshot for humanity, is that many people who lived in Africa at this time probably lived lives that were tied to shifting agriculture, and they don't tend to live in one place for a very long period of time, and it means that they never intensively exploit one region for agriculture. The population, as a result, tends to grow very slowly, and we can see that even the basic ideas of technology spread extremely slowly in sub-Saharan Africa. We know, for instance, that really well past the millennium. There were some places, for instance, in southern Africa, that actually never got the wheel. That it took a long time to get a technology like the wheel down there because these difficulties in actually communicating. And of course, you can understand if you don't have the wheel, things like transportation, milling, all of these kind of things are really severely inhibited. All right, I've talked a lot about we don't know. So what do we know in Africa? So today we're just going to limit ourselves to right around the period of before the year 1000. Any conversation about sub-Saharan Africa in this period starts with the kingdom we know as Kush, which, as you can see here, is located directly to the south of Egypt. And this is actually the first African state other than Egypt about which we have any real information. And in fact, many of our sources actually come from Egypt. This is actually going to be a place that was really the extreme border region of Egypt, and there are going to be intensive communication and contacts between the two. And the reason for that is very clear if you look at the map. Egypt and Kush are connected by the Nile. The Nile goes directly from there, and all kinds of Egyptians will actually travel into Kush on a regular basis. In part because they recognize that Kush and the sub-Saharan Africa more generally had gold. And that's part of the reason why they become very interested in it. What we're going to see is that in some cases too, some of the people of Kush, even before it has its own sort of formal kingdom, some of the people of Kush will actually end up joining the Egyptian army or fighting as mercenaries for Egyptians. So they really begin to learn a lot about Egypt just because there's this people going back and forth across these two regions. We think in time, the interactions with Egypt are going to prove to be so intensive that the people of Kush in time are actually going to imitate a lot of Egypt's culture, including, you get some idea here, these things here. They should look very familiar to you, not because you've seen them in Kush, but because you've seen them in Egypt. They begin to use a form of pyramid, smaller pyramid, but yet it's identifiable as a pyramid, to be able to bury some of the important rulers in Kush. We're also going to see that the interaction is so intensive in Kush that they begin to adopt the Egyptian form of writing, hieroglyphs. And in fact, they begin to tweak the system a little bit to use it for their own writing. But very clearly to us at the beginning, those people who can read hieroglyphs in Egypt can also read them in Kush. So it's a system that's very similar. In Kush, they're going to become, for the most part, the relationship between Egypt and Kush is going to tend to be a fairly uneven one, in as much as Egypt, when they first start coming to Kush, and really start treating many people who live there quite poorly. But as time goes on, the relationship begins to change. Especially as Egypt gets involved with more and more foreign wars, it's going to weaken. And in fact, some of the kings of Kush are actually going to come from the south and conquer Egypt. And so, in fact, there's going to be a period of time where 5 of the kings of Kush will also simultaneously be kings of Egypt, be pharaohs as well. So sometimes referred to as the Black Pharaohs. Unfortunately, though, we don't think that no one probably could have done it, but these leaders who had kings in 2 different places are not going to be able to help Egypt ultimately all that much, as it gets attacked by more and more of the great kingdoms of the ancient Near East. And so we think in time what ends going to happen is that the kings of Kush are going to decide that Egypt is not really worth it anymore. And they're going to basically retreat to Kush and leave Egypt to its own devices. And culturally speaking, they're going to begin to break off the 2 of them increasingly. So really, those kind of trends of, well, they're really deeply immersed in Egypt at one point. Those are going to break off entirely. We're not going to see Kush looking to Egypt anymore. Instead, we're going to see Kush increasingly looking to other places in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the benefits they're going to have in doing that is far before many other places in sub-Saharan Africa, virtually anywhere, had discovered how to cast iron. The King of Kush does know how to do that. And in fact, for a certain period of time, we think that Kush is going to become the primary production center of iron in Africa. And we think that in Kush itself, that they're going to use iron both for weapons and also for agriculture. Again, you should not think, again, because of the same sort of challenge I've told you earlier, this does not mean that everywhere in Africa automatically gets iron. But it does mean slowly we begin to see the diffusion, and so people can begin to use iron in addition to other kind of weapons that they have at their disposal, and which has also helped to strengthen Kush as a whole. Iron, of course, is useful for battles. It's also useful for agriculture, and even just the basic. In many places in Africa, as I said, the forests were so large, so intensive, that even being able to clear the land to do appropriate agriculture is going to require a huge amount of iron tools. So iron actually helps to clear out certain spaces when it arrives in certain parts of Africa. So it's ultimately going to allow for more settled agriculture as a whole, and really slowly breaking up places that previously had just been given over to hunter-gathering. Even with that, though, there are severe limitations to what ends up happening with iron, and these come from environmental factors. And one of the questions people often used to ask about sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, is why did they get the plow? Unlike previous generations of historians who just say, well, you know, they were not advanced enough, most people now tend to realize that there's virtually no animal at the time that could have survived the kind of diseases that animals got in sub-Saharan Africa. So if they had developed a plow, there really would have been nothing to pull it. So it really would have made little sense. This is probably the real reason why we don't see the plow to develop at this period. All right. I should have another map here. Another of the main places, the main kingdoms that we talk about here in Africa is, as you can see here, all the way in on the coast here. This is Ethiopia, which in the ancient period was even larger than it is today. We think that eventually in time, Kush is going to lose its mantle as one of the strong sub-Saharan African kingdoms, and the kingdom that's really going to pick up a lot of its previous business and really become dominant for a period of time is Ethiopia. Really, Ethiopia is fascinating to many of those people, especially for Christians, because for centuries, Ethiopians were going to be the only people in sub-Saharan Africa who converted to Christianity. And really at a very early date, 4th century, the kingdom converts. So for instance, this is a very famous victory column that was put up in the 4th century in Africa, in Ethiopia. If you start to read the inscription on it, initially it appears that this is like any other sort of propagandistic text you read before. The king talks about all the people he's managed to slaughter and trying to scare people into submission. But the very interesting part about it is the God he gives thanks for all of this, which in fact is Jesus. Which is a clear sign, in fact, that already by this point, the royal house and most other people had converted to Christianity. And in fact, in Ethiopia, they not only convert to Christianity, but they begin to trace these very sort of interesting stories that will tie them to the biblical past. And so in Ethiopia, they're going to claim that the biblical Queen of Sheba, who actually ended up having sex with Solomon in the Bible, This actually was the founder, supposedly, of their royal house. And they can trace their lineage back to Solomon. And we may, of course, refer that this is a myth, but it's a myth that shows just how tied in they felt with the biblical story as a whole. One of the reasons we care a lot about Ethiopia is that not only are they powerful militarily, but economically speaking, they are very lucky. They are located again on the east coast, and they're able to have ports that are easily accessible to outsiders, like eventually people like Greeks and Romans. And they were able to bring to market things like, for instance, ivory and various other things that they could get, again, exotic items really basically from Africa. And we can see Roman amphora, these sort of containers that have been left there from ancient trading. And we also see that the kings of Ethiopia begin to get the idea that they begin to see coinage from people like Romans that has people's faces on it. And so they actually begin to mint their own coins that will have the faces of native kings on it in a very similar fashion. For really, Ethiopians will, and this is actually a building that, really some parts of it are extremely ancient. They've been there for a long time, especially this period. For a long period, then Ethiopians were in contact with the rest of the world, the rest of the Christian world as well. But what's fascinating to us is that after the Muslim invasions that cut off North Africa from most of the rest of the world, this would be the only Christian kingdom that would last for centuries, and really, frankly, with very little contact with the rest of the Christian world. They really went off on their own path entirely. Interesting to note, too, is that other than the Muslim countries to the north, the only literate place we can tell in sub-Saharan Africa at this point was Ethiopia. And this, of course, should be no surprise in some way, in that with the coming of Christianity, also, we think, came literacy. And then we begin to see people translate things like the Bible and their liturgy all into their local language, the Semitic language. For some of the other places in sub-Saharan Africa, we're really entirely dependent upon some of the travel accounts that were written by Arabs, essentially by Muslim travelers who would come down. Similar to the Egyptians, the main goal was to be able to extract some sort of wealth from these territories and take them back. But we're lucky sometimes that some of these Muslim accounts will actually talk about the people that they saw there. And some of these, we really think as Muslims begin to travel to different places within sub-Saharan Africa, they really went out of their way to promote stable political communities. Not because they really cared about the Africans, but we think Muslim traders, more than anything else, wanted to see stability. They wanted to know that they were going to go back and meet the same exact people to trade with every single time. And so they actually throw their weight, in some cases, behind certain political organizations there. One of these African states that we think really begins to thrive as a result of this interaction is this place, this kind of green splotch here in West Africa that is known as the Ghana Empire. For those of you who are playing along at home, by the way, and you know your geography very well, this Ghana is not where modern-day Ghana is, which is actually to the south of this. And it was named after this historical empire. For those who do not know where modern-day Ghana is, you can just cast it out of your mind entirely for the purposes of this class. In some degree, the Ghana Empire, which is a modest empire, but still one that's important in this period, we don't really know how it comes to be. When Muslim merchants begin to come here in large numbers, it appears to have already been a sizable political organization. Some people have speculated that it may have been that the leaders of this area gained iron weapons, they gained the mastery of horses before others do. In essence, they conquer portions of around this area. And as you can see, it's around 500 miles across, so it's large enough in size. But we really see when Muslims begin to come in, we think that in addition to just having military might, it also begins to develop a major economy, which is to say, we think that Muslims respected this region primarily as an area where you could get gold. This map will give you some idea of the kind of gold networks that begin to grow up. Places on the west coast of Africa drew from a series of mines, and then eventually they make their way up to the Ghana Empire, where Muslims will take it up further to the north, and sometimes even beyond the Muslim world. And the further you travel with gold, the more you can sell it for eventually. And that's really the reason why it lubricates the European trade. In addition to that, we think that Muslims want salt. Salt, actually, which is used at this time often to preserve meat, is a valuable commodity, and they'll actually trade it for the Ghana Empire. Sort of a little more pessimistically, in this period also, we already see some Muslims trading for slaves, not in large numbers yet, but once those trading posts existed, in the future, they're actually going to become much more extensive. And, it's hard to measure exactly the effect this kind of trade would have had within the Ghana Empire. One way that historians have done it in the past is what you actually begin to see in this period, the first time, people beginning increasingly to build in stone, which takes a lot more money than simply building in mud brick, for instance, or wood. In fact, we actually do have some buildings preserved from this period where we assume that the money is in part flowing from the gold trade and the salt trade, and allow people to be able to have more money. All right. You'll notice if you've been looking at the map that we've been talking about so far, places like Ethiopia, if you can see it, Kush, and the Ghana Empire. What they have in common is that they tend to be in this sort of like northern area within sub-Saharan Africa. And in as much as we can speak about anything really, that tends to be the period that area that people focus on the most in talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And the rule of thumb generally is the further you begin to penetrate to the south, the worse things get in terms of our knowledge. Our ignorance grows the further south you go. The one thing that we do know a lot about that actually has been studied intensively is this very major migration that is going to take people now all over south and southern regions of Africa. This is a migration known as the Bantu migration. Bantu is a term that's very difficult. The Bantu peoples, so originally it's simply, Bantu as a term seems to refer to people who live in an area that is modern day Nigeria. And we think the term Bantu simply they would use initially to refer to one another as people, basically. We now use it to refer to the Bantu peoples, people who live in this region who are going to undertake this migration. Confusingly, it also refers to a linguistic group. There's a group of languages we refer to as the Bantu languages. What's confusing about this maybe is Bantu is not just one language anymore. We think it probably started off as one original language. Now it's very similar in Western Europe to the Romance languages, which all started with Latin and eventually will turn to all sorts of different languages. Bantu languages are very similar. We think it's probably started as one language. That language is gone, but now we have a series of languages that still exist in Africa today that will take as their root this initial language. And we know that because they have enough similar characteristics for us to be able to say that they start with the same language. This is going to become more obvious in a second, but what's weird about this kind of evidence is that this is probably the first time we've talked about in which linguistic evidence becomes absolutely essential for reconstructing these paths, because we can't actually trace a lot of this kind of migration. A lot of this is guesswork. But we can see that a lot of this sort of research started with the question about how did a lot of these people in these regions of Africa all end up with a very similar language, and it started from there more or less. All right, so this group, this initial group who lives in this area of Nigeria, it appears that some of these Bantu peoples would live right along rivers. And they would use canoes to navigate in the area right around them, sometimes going to open areas, sometimes trading with people in forests. So far as we can tell, the original Bantu people cultivated things like yams and millet, and they kept goats. Politically speaking, we don't tend to think it was a complex structure. We think that the Bantu peoples tended to have they have like basically a series of chiefs who ruled over the various villages. And we do think that the Bantu peoples had an awareness that although they were agricultural peoples, there were other peoples in the forests who were still hunter-gatherers, and they would trade with them on a regular basis. So they knew who these people were, they knew where they lived. We think that the Bantu peoples had all sorts of things to give to some of these forest peoples, like for instance, pottery, finished axes, that kind of thing, for things that you could find in the forest, unfinished products, like say for instance, meat, honey, timber, that kind of thing. They would trade for. Possibly because the Bantu peoples were so good at what they did, producing agriculture, we see that their population begins to spike. And the problem is that we think that their original homeland was not big enough to be able to carry all of these people. And so that's when we first begin to see this interest among the Bantu people to begin to migrate to areas in which they could actually live or increase their communities. And because the Bantu already had this custom seemingly of constantly going on canoes, traveling, scouting out new territories for trade, it actually was not much of a leap for them to do the same thing, but now not with the purposes of trading. They just begin to get on their canoes and they begin to take their populations and push further into the south. The good part about this is that it can be repeated endlessly. As Bantu populations spike, some small subsection of the population breaks off, they get in their canoes, then they go push further down to the south, they look for another region in which there are very few people, and they populate. And so on. Again, this really begins to take over virtually all of South Africa, with the exception of some of these areas in the southwest that are too desert-like really to live in the first place. We also think, although it's much harder for us to see, we tend to think that the further these people push down to the south, the more conflict they got into. Some of those hunter-gatherers who previously had been friends probably begin to move against the Bantu peoples because they recognize, in fact, they're muscling in on their territory. But we do think now that so far as we can tell, the Bantu peoples had an advantage over some of the natives of the region that they came to. Bantu peoples appear to have iron weapons, which are really very useful. They've used the iron weapons, first of all, to clear land for planting, but they could also use weapons, of course, to be able to turn against some of these hunter-gatherers. And so they really begin to, in fact, also wipe out some of the other peoples, competing peoples in the region who also want to continue to live there. Altogether, what we see, the end product of this, is that the language group, which, as I said, it started as a unified language. The Bantu language will be differentiated, and to the point today, it has become around 500 different languages, and encompass around 90 million people speak some variant of a language that have begun with this relatively small linguistic group in modern-day Nigeria. And we, to this day, have a lot of difficulty trying to figure out exactly what happens with some of these sort of new political villages or new groups that grow up. We don't, as far as we know, it appears that these new villages that were set up by the Bantu peoples would very closely mirror the ones they had back in their original homeland, chiefdoms. You have a very powerful male who will take over an area. Kinship appears to have been extremely important in terms of ruling, in terms of customs. We don't see any scale, at least in the sources that we have, which admittedly are few, of any sort of like a large-scale empires or kingdoms, bureaucracy, standing armies. We don't think these things really existed, which again is part of the reason why we don't have much in the way of sources from them. And we do tend to think these places probably had customs that kept people in check. They had respect for tradition, but other than that, it doesn't appear that there's much that could bind allegiance to people. Because of that, because of the smallness and the weakness of some of these states, we tend to think they're very transitory. I mean, some of these villages will come and then they'll go within the course of a few generations. At least that's how we imagine it takes place. All right, the last thing I'll talk about a little bit when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa in this period is religion. As I've said earlier, the only Christian state in Sub-Saharan Africa was Ethiopia in this entire period. We also will begin to see, with many of these Muslim traders, some of the Muslim traders were obviously just in it for the money. Other people, however, were traveling with these same sort of expeditions, who were traveling with the Muslim expeditions, wanted to do missionary work. We actually see that various places, even in this early period in Africa, we have some indications that Islam does spread to certain places, especially again those areas in which there was already a Muslim footing. There was already trading set up. That's the areas in which missionaries tended to operate fairly well. It appears to us that the people who really wanted to accept Islam, by and large, were leaders. We don't tend to think that the conversion really went very far down the social ladder. And in fact, many of those same leaders themselves, or at least openly, would embrace Islam, would really be totally tolerant of their populations who remain attached to their native beliefs. Other cases too, we know that there's actually ends up being mixtures. Some people will basically accept Islam, but will continue to do some of the native religious practices, and that didn't really bother many people in Africa. It does sometimes bother Muslims who came in more conservative, who felt that you have to convert and just convert completely. That was not necessarily what most people thought there. The bigger question, though, really, then, is since conversion, there's never this huge wave of conversion outside, really, of Ethiopia. The bigger question is, well, what did everybody else believe? I mean, what were these native traditions that existed? And you'll be just as unhappy to learn as with everything I've said. Basically, we don't have a lot of knowledge about exactly what people's religious beliefs were in this time period. And what little we think we know, it appears that there were huge variations according to the exact time and place. And Sub-Saharan Africa is a big place, and we're talking about a wide swath of time. If I am to generalize it, now it's the world's tip, of course, so I will continue to do that. What we do think of is that most people probably had some belief that there were gods or spirits. You don't really find many atheists probably in this region. And this, of course, would not be a surprise to us based on other civilizations we've seen. When we can find myths, it appears that people thought that either gods or spirits were responsible for creating human beings. They continued to interact with human beings, especially, perhaps more so than other places, through the natural world. And one of the ways we really see the sort of influence of spirits or gods is through everyday contact with nature. Again, as we've seen from other civilizations, there were a kind of a priest-like class, we think, in certain places of sub-Saharan Africa, who had gained the ability, either through blood or through training, that they could actually come into contact with spirits through ritual. These were sometimes when Europeans came in contact with these people, they referred to them as medicine men, because there was no very clear, we don't think there was much of a clear separation between these people who were curing sometimes people spiritually, but also physically, simultaneously. They were basically dispensing things that we refer to as medicines, but they didn't see that as being any different from the rest of their calling. We do get some sense that some of these priests are basically like shamans from other culture, where they can do rituals in which their souls would leave their bodies and then they can come into contact with other spirits. And we do think that spirits, we think, have enormous power, from what we can tell. They could reward humans, they could punish them. And on a really elemental level, spirits could guarantee a good harvest, they could help your leader in war, they could help with birth, all these kind of basic things. And neglecting spirits, again, could rain down destruction upon you. All of these things are maybe things that we've heard before in other civilizations. If there's something that people think is slightly different about sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the broad beliefs people have, is that ancestors play an absolutely essential part in their religious systems. In effect, a large portion of their religious beliefs appear to be sort of ancestral worship, keeping alive the sort of links between you and people who had gone before you, your family. And in fact, there clearly, obviously, was some kind of belief in the afterlife, because these souls, you could still communicate with them, they could still have an influence on the world we live in. And in fact, some people appeared in sub-Saharan Africa to believe that it was easier to come to contact with ancestors of your own family members because they cared more. First of all, they were easy to get into contact with because sometimes you knew them, but then they cared more about your fate and the people who came after them. So, in fact, it was actually strategically intelligent to do that as well. As I've said before, though, exactly the conception of afterlife is a little bit unclear, but there is some kind of afterlife, obviously, for people. If all these talk about spirits is correct. You should take all of this with a grain of salt, as I said, because both of our ignorance about large swaths of African society, and again, the variety we know is there, but those are just pointers. All right, folks, I will see you on Wednesday. For those of you who didn't collect quizzes, I have quizzes. Thank you.